What if I told you this is bad art, and this is good art? You'd probably think I'm just trying to be pretentious, and in a way I am, but in a historical context, there is more artistic expression in this artwork than there is in this artwork. Because artistry is beyond what meets the eye. To understand why, we have to stop looking at art as a hobby and instead start looking at it as a transaction. Because that's what it was for the majority of history. You see, way back when cameras didn't exist, the depiction of people were rare. You and I would not be getting our portraits done. So people who could afford their own portraits hired artists to depict their likeness, and you better believe they'd be getting their money's worth. This meant that the people funding the art, or the patrons, had the final say over what kind of art was being made. Naturally, these patrons would want their art to look good. You know, realistic, noble, powerful. It was basically a tool to reaffirm their power, and to make up for some of their imperfections as well. This applied not only to people like traders and kings, but to organizations of power as well, like religions, where although they were often motivated by a different message, there was still an emphasis on establishing their grandness, because establishing power meant establishing truth. So for the most part, professional art really only existed for power and to shape the perceived reality in favor of those who controlled it. Eventually, the first photograph ever would be taken in 1826 by Joseph Niepce, and soon after, the first standardized photographic process was developed. Suddenly, portraits, landscapes, and reality as a whole was a lot easier to depict, and artists were confronted by a harsh question. If a machine can capture reality perfectly, what is the point of the artist anymore? You see, for centuries, artists honed their skills in depicting the world as realistically and as beautifully as possible. Before the camera, painters were the only technology capable of preserving the way the world looked. Now that the objective reality of the world had been covered by technology, artists had to adapt and depict a new domain, the subjective reality. Artists like Claude Monet, who certainly possessed the skills of realism, became less and less concerned with depicting the world realistically, and instead focused on evoking the feeling of the scene they were depicting. You can see in the brushstrokes of these paintings that this is not the way the world looks, but it is often how the world feels. This new Impressionist era embraced that idea. Instead of carefully polishing every detail, artists used visible brushstrokes and loose forms to capture fleeting moments of light, atmosphere, and movement. They weren't depicting the objective reality itself, but the subjective impression of it. In fact, the name Impressionism came from Monet's very own artwork, Impression Sunrise. The story goes that when critics saw the painting at an independent exhibition in 1874, one journalist, reflecting the opinion of the past, mocked the work for looking unfinished, saying it didn't look like a painting, but an impression of one. That label was meant as an insult, but artists embraced it, and the name stuck. You might be wondering, if the powerful didn't want to patron his art, then how did Monet make a living? Well, around this time, the art world was shifting from artists relying on patrons to the art market, a place where artists could sell their artworks that reflected their own perspective, not that of a patron. The Impressionists would eventually garner international recognition, thanks to early supporters of the movement like art dealer Paul Durand-Ruel, who helped popularize the movement beyond Europe and into the United States. And once artists were no longer bound to a single patron's demands, art began to change much faster. Suddenly they were freed from the expectation of depicting reality, and began to experiment on how to represent the world. Art moved further and further away from realism, which left more for the viewer's interpretation. Over the next few decades, experimentation in art would accelerate rapidly. What began with artists capturing fleeting moments of light and atmosphere would eventually turn into movements that abandoned realistic interpretation almost entirely. By the early 20th century, artists like Piet Mondrian were reducing reality down to simple lines, shapes, and primary colors. But this wasn't for no reason. This abstraction was exploring ideas about balance, harmony, and the structure of reality, stripping existence down to its bare essence symbolically and encouraging the viewer to see a world beyond the distinctions of visual appearance. That's not to say the detailed works of the past lack symbolism. Paintings like the Arnolfini portrait were filled with symbols, but those symbols largely served the interests of the patron, reinforcing their wealth, status, and virtue. As artists gained independence, symbolism began to shift away from crafting reality in the eyes of the patron to expressing the artist's reality in which they perceived. But that was 200 years ago. You'd expect art to continue in that direction, or at least fulfill those ideals, given the impact of these artists historically. So what happened? How did we get here? Who is telling us to draw the powerful and these celebrities as realistically as possible? We don't have patrons anymore, right? Or do we? Today, the patron isn't a king, a merchant, or a church. In fact, we still have a market where art is consumed. But that market doesn't sell art anymore. It sells attention. Instead of a powerful patron deciding what gets made, artists now face a different kind of pressure. The pressure to create work that spreads, sells, and attracts attention. Just like the patrons of the past, these forces tend to reward art that is immediately impressive, recognizable, and easy to understand. Hyperrealism fits perfectly into this assembly line of a system. A perfectly rendered celebrity portrait or photorealistic drawing is instantly comprehended. It doesn't require context, interpretation, or reflection. In fact, it barely requires your attention. All you have to do is look at it and think, wow, that's impressive. And if we reward art that simply looks impressive and realistic, it shouldn't be surprising that machines are starting to outperform us at exactly that, just like the camera did centuries ago. So while our new patron promotes this, it also seems to really care about making sure we don't land back here. You've probably seen it, like these videos of artists embarrassing themselves, or just nonsensical crap that makes you ask, is this art? That's exactly how the algorithm is training you to react to art like this, despite all the meaning. That's not to say you shouldn't admire skillful artists. There is no doubt that these are impressive. But by immediately dismissing art you don't understand, or refusing to engage with art that isn't immediately pleasing, we're doing something ironic. We're siding with the patron instead of the artist. And in many ways, this brings us back to where art started. For centuries, kings, merchants, and institutions used art to shape how reality was seen, presenting a world that reinforced their power and status. When that ended, artists helped move the world beyond that era, and allowed us to explore ideas, emotions, and possibilities that the powerful didn't approve of. The artists helped us create an idea of hope, one where we weren't divided by things like visual differences. In other words, art stopped telling us what to see and started inviting us to imagine. That imagination is exactly what the patron is scared of. A reality not defined by the powerful, but by the vision of the powerless.